Cornerstones of Kannada Theatre, Companions, Companies and Colonization. We have three panelists, and I'd like to invite them on stage. First, we have Dr. Natraj Huliyar, who's an acclaimed short story writer, playwright, and cultural critic, former professor at Bangalore University. He has authored and edited over 50 books. A three-time Karnataka Sahitya Academy Award winner, he received the 2017 Sahitya Shri Award for Lifetime Achievement in Literature and Translation. We have H.S. Shivaprakash, poet, playwright, scholar, an award-winning poet, playwright, and scholar. He has received the Sahitya Academy Award in 2013, the Sangeet Natak Academy Award in 1997. He's a global expert on Indian and European theatre, and his work explores medieval literature, Kannada Vachana, poetry, comparative aesthetics, religion, and the semiotics of translation and adaptation. Third, we have Madhava Chippali. He's an agriculturalist, translator, and scholar teaching history of theatre, philosophy, and aesthetics at Ninasam Theatre Institute. With a PhD from Manipal University, he has translated works by Tolstoy, Ziauddin Sardar, Racine, and Euripides into Kannada, earning recognition for his contributions to literature and translation studies. Welcome. I'd like to invite Professor Rakesh Basant to give the stalls to our speakers. So the mics are kept next to you, sir, on the table.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank Professor Rakesh Basant and the HLF family for inviting me here. And it's a great honor to be with two important people of Kannada creativity and criticism, Professor H.S. Shivaprakash and Professor Natraj Huliyar. Today we are talking about the history of Kannada theatre. And before I open the stage up for the two speakers here, I'll set up a small background as a context to what they're going to speak. And compared to the last 2 days, the sessions today are, I learned that structured a little different in the sense that many of the sessions today are not book-based. So even our session has all the pros and cons of having no boundaries. So let's see how the conversation goes forward. When we talk about history of Kannada theatre, like many histories in India, this is not a linear history. So there are different traditions of theatre, which are traditions of theatre, modes of theatre, alive in Kannada simultaneously. So we have traditions like Yakshagana, Doddata, Sannata. These are the theatre practices which are usually categorized as traditional. And we have company Natak, and these companies are alive. They perform over the season. And though they are struggling, they're still alive. So this is, you might consider it as the transition from the tradition to modern. And this tradition modern is also a very difficult category to talk about in terms of Kannada theatre. In a minute, I'll also explain why the category of modern and traditional is problematic in the context of Kannada theatre. And then we have, if you want to call it contemporary Kannada theatre or quote-unquote modern Kannada theatre, Kannada playwrights starting from 1890s to the present day. And we have translations of plays from various languages to Kannada. And the history of translations is also very fascinating. I'll just drop one title which always fascinates me. That is, it was a translation of Othello, one of the early translations of Othello to Kannada uh, in 1885. And the title of the adaptation was called Raghavendra Rao. So you can see the kind of minds working just by looking at the title of that play. And then both from other Indian languages like Sanskrit and non-Indian foreign languages like English and other European languages. Then we have Kannada plays directed by non-Kannada directors, and plays of other languages produced and performed in Karnataka, particularly in places like Bangalore. What is interesting is all these traditions are continuing theater practices, and they're alive at the same time today in Karnataka. And these are not museumized pieces which will be seen only in theater institutes and festivals. No, these are traditions which are continuing traditions. So therefore, for a Kannada theater audience, Kalidasa, Bhavabhuti, or Tagore, Mohan Rakesh, or even Kannada playwrights like H.S. Shivaprakash, Natraj Huliyar, or Kambar, all these people are contemporary people. So how do we talk about history of Kannada theater in such a context? And I was telling you that binaries like tradition and modernity, or even Indian and Western, or ancient and contemporary is problematic in the context of Kannada theatre. I'll just tell you a couple of anecdotes to explain what I mean by the problem of these categories. This anecdote is from Gubbi Company. Gubbi Company was in the peak of its glory around Indian independence. This was the time when realism was entering Indian minds, and the Indian minds were grappling with the idea of realism. And Gubbi Company was already famous for bringing real elephants and horses on stage. Once they were performing Ramayana, and particularly the episode where Sita is in the Ashokavana, and they wanted to bring in the element of realism on stage. So apparently, they went and cut a branch of a mango tree and put it on stage because that looked like a real tree. And that was that worked well for a couple of shows, and then they started feeling that, see, that is Ravaneshwara's Ashokavana, and this is a poor branch of a mango tree. How can it match? So they wanted to enrich that realism, enrich that mango tree. So what they did was they went to the market, they bought real mangoes, and then they tied it to the tree. It worked for a couple of shows, and then even that looked a little dull. For the next shows, they brought different kinds of fruits. Like on that mango tree branch, there was mangoes, there were bananas, there were grapes, and all sorts of fruits. And apparently, it went till the point where they were hanging tender coconuts. Hanuman would come there and open tender coconut and drink it on stage. And I'm told that even sweets like jalebis would be hanging from that tree. See, one might think that this episode as an example of how Gubbi Company failed to grapple with the idea of realism. At the same time, if you look at it from another point of view, this incident, this event, this series of events will give us a very interesting insight about what was going to come in the later years, not just in Indian theater, but also in Indian films. call it magical realism if you want, but the seeds of what's going to happen was already there in the experimentations done by uh, Gubby Theatre, Gubby Company. And I'll give you one more example of how we understand tradition and modernity and this category, which is easily called as Western, entering the category of Indian. That is, when we talk about translations of Shakespearean plays into Kannada, it is a very interesting point to note that before Kannada adaptations or translations entered the mainstream Kannada theatre, there was already an adaptation of Shakespeare's As You Like It as a Yakshagana Prasanga. This is very interesting for me because what we consider to be modern or contemporary for that time and what we consider to be the traditional. The Yakshagana is usually considered to be the traditional art form. This was much more open to bringing in Shakespeare before Company Natak or any other tradition brought in Shakespeare to its fold. So, in this context, I want to ask Professor Shivaprakash and Professor Huliyar, how do you trace the history of Kannada theatre? Or what exactly is Kannada theatre? I request Professor Shivaprakash to respond to this question in the context of Kannada theatre and its relationship with other what we usually call as Indian forms of theatre, like maybe Sanskrit theatre or Company Natak or the folk theatres. And I also want to bring in this idea that when we talk about Sanskrit theatre and Kannada theatre, yes, the Sanskrit plays came into Kannada theatre with Basavappa Shastri's Shakuntala or various other translations and adaptations of Sanskrit plays. But was there really a Sanskrit theatre that came into Kannada theatre, or was it just Sanskrit plays that came into Kannada theatre fold? So basically, I want Professor Shivaprakash to respond to the influences between what we broadly call as Indian traditions of theatre and Kannada tradition of theatre. Over to you, sir.
So I thought Madhav would make my task easy, but it is very difficult. When I think of theatre history, I remember something very important that Vivekananda once said. Way back in the late 70s, there was a Paschima Bonga Natya Samaroh in Calcutta. On that occasion, there was a seminar on theatre and history, which was chaired by none other than Shamik Bandyopadhyay, one of the greatest theatre scholars in India. And two main speakers were Utpal Dutt and Vivekananda. So in this seminar, Utpal Dutt, as he was a Marxist to the core, he came down very hard on traditional theatre. He said, theatre, which has to survive, it has to become part of history. And Vivekananda was sitting next to me, told me, theatre has no history. theatre is always in the present. It's happening now. So, when it comes to the historiography of our theatres, whether ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary, whatever we call it, there is not one historical lineage of theatre. There were several traditions of theatre. And most of our discussions on theatre in most of the seminars I've been to, they are focused on what can be called modern stage, a modern theatre, contemporary theatre. But in India, in the contemporaneity, there are so many forms of theatre. We have urban theatre, which is proscenium theatre. We have different kinds of protest theatres. We have rural theatres. We have tribal theatres. We have propaganda theatres. Street theatre, which started as protest theatre, later became propaganda theatre. So, normally, the theatre that we associate with a closed space is not the only theatre which is happening now. There are innumerable forms of theatre. There are still very powerful commercial theatres. In Assam, for example, popular theatre is very, commercial theatre is very, it has some name, I forget the name. They're making huge amounts of money, particularly in states where cinema is still weak. This kind of commercial theatre is doing very well. So I have to speak in terms of multiple histories of theatre, multiplicity of theatres. And if you look at the history of modern Kannada theatre, the evolution of Kannada theatre, it started as an alternative to popular theatres. Number one, so-called folk theatres like Yakshagana and Bailata. Yakshagana is still doing very well, quite well, but very well. Bailata is almost dying out. On the other hand, as an alternative to company theatre, which was basically entertainment theatre. So, the theatre of ideas, which was the brainchild of educated, English-educated middle classes, that sowed the seeds of what we call modern theatre. Since then, what we call Kannada theatre has been borrowing elements from diverse forms of theatre and that experimentation is still going on. Today, one important expression of contemporary theatre is drama school theatre. For example, Leela Sam, for example. We have this Rangaida in Mysore. These theatres have borrowed from various sources. From Sanskrit theatre, I don't think we have, except people like Kavala Narayana Padikar, who thought that they were doing Natyashastra kind of theatre. We don't know what Sanskrit theatre was like. There is, of course, in Kerala, people boast that Kudiyattam is the closest approximation to ancient Sanskrit theatre. But the eminent historian and my former student, Madhava Chippali, has proved that there is no mention of Kudiyattam in any text in Kerala before 16th century. So how can it be the closest approximation to ancient Sanskrit theatre? We don't know what ancient Sanskrit theatre was like. But Sanskrit plays, dramas have come into Kannada. Right from the start, when you look at the earliest translation of Shakuntalam, on the one hand, we have Basava Shastri's literal translation of Abhigna Shakuntalam. And there is Churumuri Sheshgiri Rao's more desi, folk kind of translation. And it's interesting that Sanskrit drama started coming into Kannada simultaneously with Shakespeare. Look at Shakespeare. He mentioned the Yakshagana adaptation of As You Like It. And there's another production I've heard about, I've not seen it. Jayatin Joshi told me that there was the adaptation of King Lear into Yakshagana called Linga Bhupati. We don't know what this adaptation was like. And then Kannada theatre borrowed from, I'm talking about the living Kannada theatre because the company theatre is almost dead. It was pure entertainment. Its eye was at the box office, though it produced great actors like Dr. Rajkumar and directors like, it became a training ground for P.V. Karan. It was basically commercial and entertainment theatre. And it had, as far as I know, because I used to watch a lot of such theatre, Gubbi Company and this Raja Rajeshwari theatre of Mahadeva Swami and Subbai Naidu's theatre, etc. The only tradition they borrowed was from Bhakti tradition. For example, Bhakta Ambarisha by Subbai Naidu was a very great, hit in those days. And one of the longest running Kannada play in the history of Kannada theatre was Yediru Siddhalingeshwara Mahatme by Gubbi Company. It ran for about 10 years. So otherwise, it was a kind of replication. Madhav used the word realism. It's not realism, it's naturalism, European naturalism, like the Parsi theatre of North India was. And later, of course, that became a paradigm for popular cinema, commercial cinema, which these days we call Bollywood and so on and so forth. When it comes to playwriting, the chief influences on the earliest playwrights of ideas, like Sriranga, though he was a great scholar of Natya Shastra, he did produce a very good translation of Natya Shastra. His plays were not influenced by Sanskrit theatre. Neither was another contemporary of his, Kailasam, was very popular in those days. They were influenced by British theatre, maybe to some extent Ibsen, perhaps more by George Bernard Shaw than by Ibsen. Because Ibsen's realism is full of intense poetry. Bernard Shaw is all prose. All was G.P. Deshpande. He said, the Marathi playwright said, people call me a playwright, but I am a dialogue writer. I am not a playwright. So Bernard Shaw was that kind of dialogue writer. So that influence was there. So it could not take root among masses. Then, because it was, I remember another very important thing that my theatre guru, Oja Kadailal of Manipur told me. If Indian theatre has to survive, it has to fight against two paradigms. One is the theatre of repetition. There is folk theatre, or what we call classical theatre. Here, what happens is, every performer follows the tradition. Of course, to some extent, he refines with his individual talent. Ultimately, it's repetition. There's very little scope for innovation. That's why when people do Bharatanatyam with multimedia, production and so on, it doesn't work. That kind of aesthetics, we're not able to reach aesthetics, we're not able to build. And the second is theatre of directorial interpretation, which is modern theatre. A director reads the play, he decides what kind of interpretation has to be put on the play. Accordingly, he manipulates the actors. So theatre of repetition, theatre of interpretation. So another paradigm of modern Indian theatre is what was created by two great geniuses, according to me. I'm not going into the nitty-gritty of Kannada theatre because I'm talking about broader categories. One is Habib Tanvir, the other is Kadailal. They worked in specific places with specific kinds of actors. Once, when Habib Tanvir was asked why he was using Chhattisgarhi folk forms in his theatre, he said, I don't use any form. I am working with Chhattisgarhi tribal actors. They have a body language. They've imbibed the traditions. And that's where they can express themselves best. So I make them do that. And Kadailal also used the inbuilt body language of the Methi actors and actresses to produce an alternative to this kind of theatre. Whereas on the whole, I think National School of Drama, which is the model of National Theatre, has made theatre into a kind of industry. It is financed by the government, fine. But if you look at the curriculum, if you look at the actor training, it's all based on Western models. Though it's true that B.V. Karat brought in a lot, quite a bit of so-called traditional elements into this theatre. He used this in the context of when using creative use of traditions became a watchword of Indian theatre. Thanks to scholars like Suresh Avasthi, they started talking about what is called rooted theatre. So that's where the people like Kavalam Narayana Padikar from Kerala and B.V. Karan. For example, B.V. Karan, Karanji did a production of Hindi translation of Macbeth, done by a great poet Raghuveer Sahai in Hindi, and he uses Yakshagana theatre. And Prasanna, who is a very important modern Kannada theatre director, he did the theatrical adaptation of Madiko's Duvida, and he uses the Harikatha form for this play, which means forms started being used like masalas in our theatre. So this use of folklore has been, to a large extent, fake lore. But there are also creative ways of relating to traditions. For example, I'm very happy as an alternative to National School of Drama, Ninasam is trying to produce some kind of rooted local theatre. At the moment, I'm remembering one production of Kannada by my dear departed friend Gopal Krishna Iyer, was the earliest alumni of National School of Drama, but later he gave that up and created his own kind of theatre. For example, in his production of Kannada, he used the Nairi ritual as a paradigm, because Nairis are a very small minority in coastal Karnataka, maybe not even a few thousand people. And one day, their Brahminhood is bestowed on them. A certain ritual is performed, the Brahmin is bestowed on them, the Brahmin caste is bestowed on them. And when the sun sets, the ritual ends, and he has to tear off his sacred thread, and again he becomes a Nair. So, through this ritual, he could relate to the story of Karna, who was supposed to be a Sutaputra. I have seen several productions of Kannada, but this was the most powerful adaptation of Kannada because it used a kind of traditional ritual in an organic way which dovetailed with the content of the play. Otherwise, we have people who use folk forms decoratively, like Ratan Priya, whose play first premiere, Kannada was premiered in this Calcutta festival I mentioned earlier. Where in the last scene, when Karna decides to go into the battle, he already knows his fate. Then this, you have this kirtan with Manipur, drum beating, which gymnastic kind of drum beating. They go on doing this, and they roll around like a wheel, and there are flags. So, in theatre, the scene which is the most pathetic scene in the play, where the audience should be in tears, he made it a kind of Cecil B. DeMille kind of spectacle. So this is what happens when folk elements are used against the grain of folklore. That's when Utpal Dutt was right. Folklore becomes fake lore. But Kannada theatre has borrowed certain things from classical theatre, folk theatre, and when it comes to Professor Natraj, we will talk about Western influences, but I feel that our exposure to outside influences has been very lopsided. It's come only through one window, that is English. Even Greek drama came to us through English, except that Kavem Raghavachar did Antigone and the other play straight from Greek, and B.M. Street knew some Greek. Ashwatthama was influenced by that. But we have learned very little from South East Asian theatres and non-British European theatres, except there was some influence of absurd theatre, French absurd theatre during the one phase of modernism. So we still have a lot to learn from other traditions. Plus, modern theatre has come to stay, the proscenium theatre. We can't wish it away, but we should find alternatives to this, because now a lot of the theatre people say we have no auditorium, we have no budget. So it should be possible to do theatre with small budget, for theatre to become expressive. And first of all, we should realize that theatre is a threatened form now. Either it will become part of showbiz. You have seen some highly, praised productions. They were just, it was not theatre, it was like light and sound show. That's not theatre. Theatre is something small, something human, something intimate within that kind of theatre. And I hope there'll be more experimentation, exploration in this direction. So I've taken, I think, longer than the time given to me, so I stop here.
Thank you, Professor Shivaprakash, for this very insightful presentation. We'll have a lot of questions about this, but we'll come back to you after Professor Natraj Huliyar will speak. I request Professor Huliyar to respond to the questions that I raised, that is, what exactly is Kannada theatre, or what is the history of Kannada theatre in the context of the conversations between Kannada theatre and what we largely call as non-Indian traditions, be it Shakespeare, Brecht, or the European, non-European traditions. Please, sir.
Thank you, organizers, and thank you, Madhav. As you rightly mentioned, Shakespeare and Brecht, they have been a major presence in modern Kannada theatre. I'll get to those writers in detail in the later part of my presentation. My focus will not be on theatre, Western theatre, but the Western plays in general, how the Kannada theatre had a dialogue with the West and Europe, and how the Kannada theatre negotiated it. And this is a history scholars conference. If someone is interested in writing parallel history of cultural history of negotiations with the West, there is a lot of scope if one studies the history of Kannada theatre, modern Kannada theatre, which runs from about 1880s or so till today. I'd rather go there and look into my notes and speak because I also, like Nietzsche, believe conservative is the man who sits and thinks and mostly sits. So I'd go there and talk.
This one? Yeah. Whenever Kannada playwrights had dialogues with the West, it is not that they have just imported the Western theater or Western plays. They have read it, misread it, altered it, reinterpreted it, renegotiated it, and recreated it along with whatever plays they were writing here. So I'll just play some of the patterns of Kannada theatre and drama. Its negotiation with the non-Indian world, mainly Western and European. The first social play, supposed to be the first one, by Karki Venkataraman Shastri towards the end of the 19th century. It's called Iggappa Heggade Vivaha Prahasana. Perhaps announces the onset of modernity clearly in the Kannada plays in a sense. The outlook of the play was modern, the message of the play was modern. Iggappa Heggade Vivaha Prahasana in English would be the farce of Iggappa Heggade's wedding, where a middle-aged Iggappa marries a young girl paying the bride price, and the young girl naturally goes with her beloved, and the issue comes before the court. So this is where colonialism and the colonial court, the modern court, comes into picture. The court rules in favor of the girl in the 19th century, end of 19th century, and upholds her choice of freedom. Karki Venkataraman Shastri, who used theatre and drama as a tool to critique his society. He comes from South Kannada, North Kannada. Karki Venkataraman Shastri is from, I think, Uttar Kannada. I suddenly can't recall. He was trying to reform his society. He was a critical insider. He was critiquing his own society. The Havyak Samaja was trying to reform. So this is how the modern Kannada theatre, modern Kannada dramatist dialogue with the West, I think, began. It set a pattern. Later, many a Brahmin playwrights continued this tradition from, later Sriranga did it, Kailasam did it, Shivaram Karanta, did it. They were self-critical of their own societies. They all knew, if at all, if criticism should begin, it should begin at home. They started criticizing, they started critiquing their own conservative societies, which were mainly focused on the liberation of women, as it happened with Rajaram Mohan Rai's movement. The focus was on women here, women liberation. So the West entered through theatre, through dramatists, as rationalism, as scientific outlook, as new reasoning, as liberation, as new institution, as new law, modern law. There was a lot of conflict between the traditional laws and the modern laws. That itself is a longer history, the conflict between the modern institutions and the previous, older institutions, and so on. But the first generation playwrights somehow caught hold of Shakespeare. It was obvious because that was the colonial context. The first generation English learners started reading Shakespeare. Even Basavappa Shastri, who didn't know, he was not well-versed in reading English, you would ask someone to read Shakespeare and then translate it, try to translate it. They started adapting Shakespeare, not translating Shakespeare. They started later playwrights started adapting, Greek plays. They started adapting popular Shakespearean plays, Othello, Hamlet, Midsummer Night's Dream, Romeo and Juliet. They did not have a ready model of adaptation before them. Had they looked into their own tradition, looked up to their own tradition, their own Adikavi Pampa, they would have had a model, because Pampa altered Vyasa's Mahabharata and wrote Pampa Bharata. What Sujit Mukherjee talks of translation as new writing in the Indian context happened with Pampa, because Sujit Mukherjee would base his arguments on the ancient writers only when in the Indian context translation becomes a new writing. So they would have done it. Nevertheless, they did a new writing. But they adapted, in a sense, they tried to localize it. They did it as they liked it. So the first, one of the first instances of that adaptation is by one Anand Rao, who did Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet was adapted as, to alliteration is also carried there, Romeo, Juliet, Ramvarma and Leelavati. So they carried the alliteration of the characters there. So it's once again the story of the royal family. But towards the end of the play, there is a crisis for the playwright, because we were in a tradition of the plays that end with Mangalam. So you can't kill Romeo and Juliet here. You can't kill Ramvarma and Leelavati here. So towards the end, of course, Ramvarma and Leelavati, the lovers, die on the stage, but Lord Krishna would not allow them to die. Would suddenly appear and make them wake up, and everything, ends well, happy ending. Somehow, the early writers could not digest the idea of the hero, meeting an end. Meeting his death at the end. They can't just digest it, because especially when the person is good, because the hero is supposed to be good, he cannot be dead at the end. They could not, have, the hero to be dead at the end. They would not. So they altered the very tragedy form to suit their needs. Even Srikantesh Gowda, one of the smartest of the early playwrights, who had read Shakespeare, who had an idea of Elizabethan theatre, I suppose, and who had an idea of Western acting, and even he could not take the risk of making Macbeth, adapting Macbeth as a tragedy here. When he adapted Macbeth as Pratap Rudradeva, he made Malcolm the hero of the, of course, Macbeth, is there throughout the play, but the play is titled Pratap Rudradeva, who is Malcolm in Shakespeare. When they started, because they were actually, the playwrights were taking a plunge, they were taking risk to alter the idea of tragedy and all, and also they were taking a lot of licenses. Even when they took the plunge, the Pandits would not allow them to have those initiatives. They would have a lot of problems. And and even playwrights had their own doubts about bringing several things on the stage. For instance, the Kannada lady Macbeth, can she go out and welcome Duncan in public? Can she do it? No, she can't do it. Can we have a booze party, a king drinking on the stage? It's not, so you can't have it. Even if they had, the Pandits would not accept it. And a king, could he kiss his queen on the stage? All these problems arose, and somehow these things were managed or left out, or they were tried out, and those things were there. But lots of criticisms, lots of critics were there, lots of objections were raised, and there were ghost letters in the local newspapers about destroying the theatrical tradition and all. Even then, um, uh, the early playwrights went on with their adaptations, and by the time Shakespeare settled in the Kannada context, our playwrights were able to learn several things from Shakespeare. It is not that they did it consciously. It is not that they studied Elizabethan theatre, but they, I mean, from whatever they read of Shakespeare, from whatever plays that were available in India, whatever they could lay their hands on, they could, have several ideas of theatre, building up a character, and also studying history through characters. So this was not very familiar in our stage, in the local stage or the traditional, theatre, which they, picked up. The nature of intrigues as Shakespeare presents it, and changing patterns of human behavior, and also mixing lyrics with dialects. Of course, it was there in our theatre also, but the kind of Shakespearean synthesis of lyric and the dialogue, they learnt from Shakespeare, and also including comic scenes as interludes in tragic plays, tragic kind of plays, were also learned from Shakespeare. Interestingly, in those days, early 20th century or so, there was a women, drama company also, all women drama company. So this is a stage I owe it to. I mean, I think it is an impact of colonial, context, and also impact of modernity. Gradually, the company, theaters were also including women actors, and there was a full-fledged women theater at that moment. So company theater, some of the company, especially in the North Karnataka region, some of the plays that were staged were totally anti-colonial and anti-British. The theater was used as a weapon against, colonialism on the stage, and especially two plays of those days stand out as totally anti-colonial and anti-British. They were very popular plays also. One of them was made into a film later, Kittur Rani Chennamma. Both Kittur Rani Chennamma and Tipu were presented as tragic characters on the stage. The squint-eyed historians who have their own say of Tipu Sultan today may do well to go to the popular representations on the stage where Tipu was presented as a real hero, real patriot. And, late, in the 80s, when I was a student of college, I actually saw the same Tipu Sultan play, which was still very moving and poignant. It moved me into tears because, the way Tipu pledges his, children to the British officers, it was so moving, and nobody thought Tipu was alien. So this is the kind of impact, tradition. I mean, Indian theatre had, the popular theatre had on the audience about, the British. Of course, Kittur Rani Chennamma is very, very popular, and her dialogues, echoed throughout. And I have seen a lot of mono-acting, girls, picking up those dialogues of Kittur Rani Chennamma in college, theatres. And Kittur Rani Chennamma and, Tipu Sultan presented, rather, they made fun of the British on the stage. Lord Cornwallis comes to Kittur Rani Chennamma's court, and everybody makes fun of him, but he doesn't understand. And the kind of Kannada Cornwallis would speak is also made fun of. And these people would call British, officers as Kempu Kothi, Red Monkey, and all, and people would enjoy it, I've heard. So this is the kind of subversive activity theatre did in those days against the colonial regime. And these two plays, especially Kittur Rani Chennamma and Tipu Sultan, created a kind of English which they thought the British would the kind of Kannada which the British would speak. Cornwallis would come there and ask ಕಿತ್ತೂರಾಣಿ ಚೆನ್ನಮ್ಮ, ಕಿತ್ತೂರು ಚೆನ್ನಮ್ಮ, ನೀವು ಕಪ್ಪ ಕೊಡಬೇಕು, ಕಪ್ಪ ಕೊಡದಿದ್ದರೆ ಶಿಕ್ಷೆಯಾಗುತ್ತದೆ. So all of us thought this is how British would speak Kannada. So if you move on to a larger theory of post-colonial theories of mimicry and imitation as anti-colonial tools, here is the instance. If mimicry and imitation or subversive activities, if mimicry and imitation had their own countering of the colonialism or the British authority, here was Kannada theatre, which was taking on the British, which was supporting the nationalist movement. The moment Gandhi's name was heard on the stage, there was a lot of thrill among the audience. I've read and I've heard. So Gandhi would come as Krishna, Gandhi would come as a redeemer, Gandhi would come as a protector, Gandhi would appear as a god. And even when Draupadi's honor was at stake, Krishna appears on the stage and offers her the khadi sari, and people, audience would erupt. They would be so happy to see the khadi sari. So this is the kind of activity that was going on the Indian theatre against the colonial regime. And that's why I said, if somebody wants to write a history of nationalist movement, if somebody wants to write a history of anti-colonial sentiment, if somebody wants to write a parallel history of how Kannada theatre, had a dialogue or negotiated or altered the Western theatre, the Western play, here is a lot of material in Kannada theatre. Later, when we came to B.M. Sri in the beginning of the 20th century, B.M. Sri Kantaya was an English professor, was a scholar of Kannada, Sanskrit, he knew Tamil also. There was a conscious and well thought out reception of the West. He knew what he was picking up. He knew what he was choosing. He chose to adapt Greek tragedies. Before that, he builds a theory as to why there is no, this is a larger debated and debatable question, if there was tragedy in our culture or not. This has been already discussed several times. Let us not go into that debate now. But B.M. Sri in that juncture says why we do not have a tragic play, why we do not have Rudra Nataka, he calls it Rudra Nataka. He says we do not have the courage to look into the darkness. We do not have the courage to look into the abyss. Kannadigas should have that courage to look into that abyss and create tragedies. So with this theoretical premise, he gets on to bring in Greek plays, he adapts Greek plays, and he adapts Ajax as Ashwatthama. In the meanwhile, Kannada theatre or Kannada playwrights have translated tragedy in, with several equivalents. Tragedy as Rudranataka. Very recently, when I was talking to the NSD students, I asked them about the alternatives, the equivalents they have for a tragedy in their own languages. They came out with similar kind of equivalents. Tragedy in your languages, I don't know what they say. Tragedy is in Kannada, Rudranataka, Gambhira Nataka, Dukhanta Nataka, Duranta Nataka. Bendre even called it Sayo Ata. Sayo Ata, a play of dying. Bendre being greatest of the poets and being a very creative mind, he called it Sayo Ata. But none of them, I think, would be the best equivalent or the right equivalent of the tragedy. That's another thing. Let us not go by the word, because we adapted the idea of the tragedy, we have adapted the form of the tragedy. That's enough. Whatever nomenclature you have it for is fine, because we know the meaning of it. Thanks to B.M. Sri, we have had a solid theory, at least at that stage, and a fine adaptation of Ajax as Ashwatthama. Somehow B.M. Sri thought there was a parallel between Ashwatthama's tragedy And he viewed Ashwatthama's behavior as tragic behavior, and he found Ajax an objective correlative in Ajax. And just to show you, just to remind you of the similarity between the two. As you all know, Ajax is humiliated by his own deeds, because he goes and kills, he tries to go and kill the Greeks, but instead he goes and kills the cattle, thanks to Athena. And he goes and commits suicide. Ashwatthama, to appease Duryodhana, he goes and kills, the Upapandavas, the Pandavas' children, and is ashamed at the end. He should have been ashamed. And, B.M. Sri assumes that he is ashamed. His play assumes he is ashamed, and he goes and ends his life. There was a hue and cry. There was a big debate. There was a big cultural debate. How could Chiranjeevi Ashwatthama, end his life? How could he die? This can't be. But B.M. Sri, adapting Ajax to the body of Ashwatthama, or body to the content, or the content to the body, or whatever it is, opened up new possibilities in Kannada culture. As Professor Shivaprakash just said, all of them, actually had to read Greek plays through English only, but for Kavyam Raghavacharya, who learned Greek, but the end result was not very satisfactory. But, those who have done from English have done a better job, I think. That is fine, but in history, he did a fine job.
Professor Huliyar, I know that this is a large field and we need a lot of time to cover it. So if you can conclude your thoughts in a minute or two, we can take a few more questions, and then we still have time to talk about this, please.
Okay, so I mistook this to be a survey, and I went on. I'll close here.
Yeah, maybe
in a
minute
nobody
or two.
should blame me that I stopped on there, because I have 100 miles to cover. Okay. Yeah, we can go with the
Okay, we'll continue this conversation with a couple of questions. I'm really sorry to interrupt you in between your thoughts, but we have very limited time and a large area to cover. So I will open this up for questions. But before that, I will ask a question to both Shivaprakash sir and Huliyar sir. It's fascinating to see what was happening in the later part of 1800s. There were two translations of Shakuntala, and there was Shakespeare being translated. And also the first modern Kannada play was written around the same time. So what was it in Kannada theatre that made these very vibrant things happen in the span of a couple of decades?
Well, I think there should be other ways of looking at 18th century theatre. Professor Huliyar mentioned the Hingappa Hegde Prasanga. But where do we place Sagya Balya? Sagya Balya. It was a traditional form of theatre which was based on the contemporary event. And another play, which came a little later, I think, Kadlibatti Station Master. So, there were other kinds of experiments going on. And so they have to be taken into account. When it comes to playwriting, we have to distinguish between the later period, literary plays by people like Kuvempu, Bedre, And then those who had theatre in mind, Sriranga and Kailasam, for example. But it was thought that these so-called poetic plays, literary plays, were not meant to be performed. Professor Bharat Siddhappa, who wrote a book on Kannada theatre, said that Kuvempu's plays cannot be performed on stage. But Basulija disproved it when he did some of Kuvempu's plays in Assam, particularly this Berelge Koran in Assam. It turned out to be such a wonderful theatre piece. So these people were writing for a theatre that did not exist. And theatre has to rediscover itself through so-called literary theatre. And those who wrote for theatre, whose paradigm was already present. So this dialectics between playwriting and theatre making has to become the focus of discussion. Till now, it has not, to the best of my knowledge. Another tradition which Kannada theatre has, to which Kannada theatre has responded, is the Bhakti tradition. I said even the company theatre responded to Bhakti tradition. I should give the example, Subbai Naidu's Bhakta Barisha. There were several, Yadur's Lingeshwar Mahatma, and so on and so forth. And 12th century Sharada, people call it movement, revolution, I don't call all that. Sharada tradition became a very important inspiration for many modern Kannada playwrights. Lankesh wrote about it, Girish Karnad wrote about it, I wrote, and Natraj has written about it. So this is what important, why did this become an important paradigm for writing new plays in Kannada? That is something, it's a very Kannada specific question of theatre history. And about tragedy, I have very different views on tragedy. Many people believe there was no space for tragedy in the tradition. Due respect to them. But they were not looking into the whole of Indian tradition. Because the first epic of Tamil, Silappadigaram, has a tragic denouement. And ancient Tamil narratives like Silappadigaram, Periyapuranam, Thiruvirupuram, etc. were not meant only for reading, they were meant for performance. The great Dravidian scholar David Shulman tells us when exactly the first performance of Periyapuranam happened at the court of a certain king in Tamil Nadu. So if you look at our folk and tribal traditions, there were many folk plays on Hirajya, for example, in the northwestern part of India. And in Tamil Nadu, you look at the folk traditions of Tamil Nadu, it's full of tragedies. Though they didn't have the concept of tragedy, the phenomenon of the tragic denouement did exist in Indian theatre. And of course, tragedy was the imposition of tragedy on the history of theatre was the historic mistake committed by Aristotle. Because this guy, ancient Greeks conceived the plays in terms of trilogies. And each one of these playwrights, for example, was Oedipus trilogy. There was this Orested trilogy. The last play of the trilogy was one of happy ending. But Aristotle, because he was an atomist, he took Sophocles' Oedipus Oedipus the Rex as one single unit and analyzed it. That became a paradigm which was smashed later by George Thompson in his great book on Greek tragedy, Aeschylus and Athens. So tragedy was all pervading in Indian folk traditions and tribal traditions. It was always there. But classical scholars, unfortunately, were not aware of it. And if you look at ancient Sangam poetry in Tamil, they don't talk about drama per se, but a lot of things they talk about are parallel to Natya Shastra. Natya Shastra makes poetry a part of theatre, Natya, whereas the Tamil tradition makes theatre part of poetry. So, as Shivaprakash in his ancient Dravidian theatre points out, what the kind of tragic intensity that ancient Greeks brought about in the theatre, ancient Tamil poetry brought about in the poetry. But tragic plays were also being practiced in pre-modern Indian theatre.
So do you have a response for this? That in the late 1800s, Shakespeare and Sanskrit plays, and also, the first modern Kannada play was written in that time. So what was it in that time that made all these things happen together? Okay. Now we'll open the floor for questions. There are any questions?
So as theatre become unquestionable,
There's a question there.
Excellent presentation, sir. Really enjoyed. And wish we had more time, we could have heard more of both of you. I'm from Mumbai and very much associated with Marathi theatre. Just out of curiosity, I want to ask, because we had this tradition of musical natak. So even in Karnataka, you had that. It's not Yakshagana. It is the like we had Sangeet Sanshay Kallol, and we had Master Dinanath, like a very Gandharva, Miss Bal Gandharva, who would act as a lady. So by chance, even Karnataka dramas had such tradition. I just want out of curiosity.
you see, there was a lot of exchange between Kannada and Marathi theatre. And in some of the plays written during that period, Kannada playwrights are, having digs at the Marathi drama and so on and so forth. G.P. Deshpande used to quote one line from one of the plays during written that period, Karanataki, that kind of thing. On the more serious note, the Sangeeta Natakam was a form which was prevalent in South India. Even this great Kirtanakara, Tyagaraja, wrote a musical play, which was performed musically. And there was Sangeet Natakam in Tamil Nadu. And the Sangeet, through Tamil influence, Sangeet Natakam was also there in Kerala. So Sangeet Natakam was an established form in Dravidian languages, and Marathi, G.P. Deshpande used to say, it's one of the Pancha Dravida Bhashas. So Marathi also it was there, it was in other languages, in Tamil Nadu, Andhra, and then in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, sir.
No, when it comes to music and theatre, there are fascinating stories of how music was used. One is the tradition of Sangeet Natak is one. And the other anecdote I remember now is that again from Gubbi Company. Professor Huliyar was referring to various kinds of post-colonial or anti-colonial plays that were performed there. But at the same time, there were much more subtle statements that were made against the colonial rule. And this anecdote about Gubbi Company is that this was again a Ramayana episode where Ravana enters on stage. And the entire play uses music from Indian traditions, but only when Ravana enters, without any other comments, they just used the English notes in the music. So it's a very subtle way of relating a character which is stereotypically considered bad with the British. So it was a very intelligent way of connecting the current politics into what was happening on stage, not very directly, but in a very subtle way which could make an impact on the minds of the audience.
Yeah, incidentally, this continued in the commercial cinema. For example, until recently, till some 20, 30 years ago, there were lots of Pati Patni Wo stories. And Wo always used to be, have a Christian name, should perform the cabaret dance. And now things changed, now heroines perform cabaret dance. So that's been integrated now, but it was there. The West was associated with evil. Christianity was, even in Shivaprakash novel, Chobanadudi, in a very subtle way, Christianity is a kind of disruptive force. It depends on the context. For example, if you read the fiction of the great Yiddish novelist, singer, Judaism is good, Christianity is evil. So some of these otherings of cultures is found in literary and theatrical imagination. Shakespeare's, for example, Jews are vilified throughout.
Just to respond to what the madam from Maharashtra raised, the kind of bond between music and theatre was severed in 1940s, I think, in Kannada, when the new theatre emerged. In fact, T.P. Kailasam went to England and saw, English plays. He met George Bernard Shaw over there, and when he came back to Karnataka, when he started his own theatre, he would not include music in his plays. And later, Srirangam and even Lankesh and Karnataka, they would not use even songs in the plays. But there are other playwrights, of course, Shivaprakash plays, they would use the songs over there. And there was musicals in a sense. Sangya Balya was a musical here in Kannada. And there was a new trend in the 80s with Kambara's plays with a lot of music and all. But the idea was more to delight than instruct if they used plenty of folksy kind of music there. So audience would be lulled into sleep, if they use that kind of music. That was also there. The debate is on. But I, for one, as a playwright, always believe there should be a lyric, a music in a play, because the audience, would respond better to a play with all these ingredients?
Yeah, I agree to this. There is a political and apolitical use of music. For example, Kabba's plays, music is a kind of spice. Whereas Subramania Bharatiyar, the great Tamil poet, wrote a Tirukuttu play, purely musical, during freedom struggle, where Draupadi's Vastrabharana became the symbol of the rape of India by the British. And he wrote it in a language which he said even school children should be able to read it. So there are different ways of using music. Even folk elements can be used decoratively or purposefully. It depends on what one is doing with it.
Yeah, but songs came back when Samudaya started its leftist presentations in street plays and all. Songs came back in a bigger way later in Kannada theatre.
Yeah, Chinmay.
After independence, was there a lot of government support for Kannada theatre, or how's the relationship between the artists, theatre, and the government, especially after independence? You talked about colonization and the battle against the British, but how did that change after 1947?
Other state you have Natka academies and all, which don't produce any, plays. There is a bit of governmental support through Kannada and culture agencies, but serious theatre groups not bothered. But Rangayana is funded by the government. Ninasam used to be funded, right? Once?
Yeah, Ninasam is still funded.
Still funded.
Not fully, but a part of Ninasam.
And there are some schools, theatre schools, which are funded by the government. Nobody is asking me any question about absence of women in the entire discourse. If somebody should ask the question, I should be able to answer this because Madhav did not allow me to speak about that.
So, should I just ask? Okay, so like we spoke a lot about Kannada theatre, and here where do we see women coming in, women as actresses, as playwrights, as directors?
You asked because I asked, but or the question was there in your mind. I suppose it was there in your mind.
You provoked the question.
I know, I could see you had that question. Okay. See, literary historians, the kind of research they have done, really appealing. There are two books on Kannada theatre history. One is by a literary historian, Tasu Shamravi. The other one is modern, scholar, K. Maral Siddhappa. None of them speak about the contribution of women to theatre. When I read volumes of literary history brought out, by Akamadevi University, an entire volume is there on Kannada theatre and women. I found about 100 playwrights and translators, in that book. In fact, street plays, when they began, there were two, women playwrights who emerged, the Ila Vijaya and Malati. Even before feminism had a strong solid root in Karnataka, they were the ones who initiated, feminism through theatre. Later, in fact, in 1944 itself, one Sita Devi Padakone, she translates Uncle Vanya of Chekhov. None of these historians mention this. And there are lots of feminist directors today. A lot, I mean, of course, excellent actors, actresses, if you want to call them so, and plenty of translators too. Somehow I was, even yesterday I asked two of, my friends who work in women theatre, if these women have translated any plays by women, none of them would say yes. They would just say, I will think and tell you. I couldn't find. If somebody has any information, please let me have. Because they all chose the popular plays by men. They have translated Ibsen, yes. There are three translators, three translations of Ibsen. One by a man and the other two by women, one by Malati and the other one by Meeramurthy. But somehow, women choosing women playwrights, bringing them into Kannada is not much, I think. Sir, are there any?
Vaidehi is also written.
Vaidehi brought in Shakespeare. A lot of them have brought in Shakespeare or Ibsen or some popular, popular. No, I'll do some research and get back.
Of course, Jayashree is a very popular director.
Yeah, of course, Jayashree. Malti was a good, Malti brought in Brecht.
Jayashree is an internationally acclaimed theatre director from Karnataka.
Jayashree and Dakshayani, Fleet.
There was another Shri who did a very good production of the Roman play. Also from NST, then she disappeared from there.
And Mrs. Maltish, I forget
Some
her
of them
name.
talked about it. Malti has talked about how difficult it was for women to survive.
That's right.
Man-dominated theatre.
Yeah, there is a cultural, crisis because the stage happens only in the evening and it's not easy for women
And
to.
some of them survive by doing patriotic plays with patriotic orientation.
Yeah.
Some women. Dr. Dev, her one famous woman director, did a play about, glorifying Sati.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. We've run out of time. I would like to invite Professor Rakesh Basan to hand over mementos to our distinguished speakers.